Jill Savage is an author and speaker who is passionate about encouraging families. She is the author or co-author of 14 books, including Professionalizing Motherhood, My Heart's at Home, Real Moms, Real Jesus, Living with Less So Your Family Has More, No More Perfect Moms, No More Perfect Marriages with her husband Mark, and her most recent release, Empty Nest Full Life. Featured on Focus on the Family, Crosswalk.com, Family Life Today, and Today's Christian Women magazine, Jill is the founder of Hearts at Home, an organization that encouraged moms from 1994 to 2017. Jill and her husband Mark have 5 children, 3 who are married, and 8 grandchildren. They make their home in Normal, Illinois. In our conversation with Jill, she shares about walking through adultery after being a pastor's wife for 20 years. She shares how to recognize red flags and slow fades that lead to infidelity and how to rebuild trust when you choose to stay. So let's get to this important conversation.
Hi, I'm Jessica.
I'm Jenna.
And I'm Stephanie.
And you are listening to Pastors' Wives Tell All,
A podcast by pastors' wives for church leaders and anyone desiring to take a peek inside our glass house.
We are breaking down walls and crushing pastors' wives stereotypes within the church.
We want pastors' wives and other ministry leaders to know that they are not alone in this. Plus, this is basically therapy for the 3 of us with a whole lot of dance parties. Woo, woo.
Hello, Jill. We are so happy to have you on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So we have actually had the honor of being on your podcast.
Yes.
And so now we are switching roles and we're so excited to learn more about you and what God has done in your life. So do you mind just sharing with the listeners who you are, a little bit about your family and what you're doing?
Yeah. So I am Jill Savage, and I live in Normal, Illinois. And we have a lot of fun with that. You know,
I'm sure.
our kids went to normal schools, and we go to a normal church. And yeah, we know
Wow.
all the jokes.
That's
but
great.
honestly, so my husband and I are relationship coaches. And what we like to say is that we really help others deal with the normal stuff of life. Sometimes the broken normal stuff of life. And when we say normal, we're just saying, hey, this, on this side of heaven, there's hurt and there's brokenness. And so that is what we now do. We primarily focus on marriages, although we do all kinds of relationship coaching as well. And that has come out of a really a lot of pain in our own life. And we're just so grateful that we not only got to the other side of that pain, but then God has now used our pain for his purpose. I'm a mom, and I'm a mom of 5 young adult kids, and they range from 28 to almost 40. I cannot believe I have a child that is almost 40. How is that even possible?
I can't either. You
I'm
do not
only
look old enough for that.
I know. I was like, okay, I didn't know that.
Give us your skincare routine.
We will put it in the link below.
Well, I'm only 30 myself. So how is that even possible, right?
It was like a miracle from the Lord.
Oh my gosh. It is the craziest thing. So yeah. And then we have 6 grandkids. And so they keep us all busy. They all live in Central Illinois, which is wonderful because we get to be involved in their lives. In fact, this evening I have to go to a volleyball game. Over the weekend, we were at a cross country meet and a soccer game. And so, yeah, we make the rounds.
You're living the grandparent life now. Yeah.
With all your normal kids and normal grandkids doing all the normal activities. I like it. So, but you haven't always just been doing this.
Yes.
You were once upon a time in church ministry. Your husband was a pastor, right? Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
He sure was. So he was a pastor for 20 years. For 10 of those years, we were on staff at a mega church. And so he was children's pastor and eventually became family life pastor. And during that season, I was also the director of women's ministries at that church. And so we were very busy. Our family was growing during that season of time. And to be really honest with you, for me, and Mark and I often, we will talk about it. For me, that church experience as a pastor's wife was Camelot. And the reason I say that is, I was one of 10 pastors' wives, and he was one of 10 pastors. And so there was not, I didn't feel like there was all these eyes always on us. And I felt like it was like the expectations were really balanced. And so it was very much a Camelot experience for me. In the midst of that, I started we had a mom's group in the women's ministry that I was leading that started out with 7 women in my living room. And within about 2 years, there were 250 women, and we were not meeting in my living room anymore.
Right.
Wow. I was going to say, so how was that?
Quite the living room.
Yeah. And so anyway, we eventually, because that was growing so much, I said, to our leadership, what would you think if we had a conference for moms? I mean, and they were like, you know what? We've seen the moms ministry grow, go for it. And so we had our very first conference for moms in 1994. Were you guys even born then?
Yes,
we were.
Yes.
85.
Yes.
And so anyway, we had the very first moms conference then, and we had 1,100 women that showed up. And we kind of went, what just happened?
Wow.
And so the church was like, Jill, this is not a church ministry. This needs to be like its own nonprofit. So we became a nonprofit. The next year, 2,800 moms. The next year, 3,400 moms. Then 4,500 moms, 5,500 moms, 6,500 moms. It was craziness. Wow. It was like, what is happening here? And truly, it was a God thing, because there was no social media in those days. There wasn't even email in those days.
Wow.
And so women,
Jesus,
it was
right.
It was Jesus, and it was just word of mouth and him prompting women. It was amazing. And so in the midst of that, my husband decided that he really felt called to church plant. And so we actually helped launch a church. He was an interim pastor for a church for a year. And in the midst of that, we began the process of beginning to church plant, which would be actually for the next 10 years. It was in our own community. So we didn't have to leave, and we didn't have to start over with relationships. But that second 10 years of ministry proved to be much more difficult. And as Mark and I often say when we are talking about our marriage journey, is that it, in probably the last 5 years of that, probably brought out the worst in both of us. It was a difficult season. The ministry to moms was growing in huge ways. It was keeping me from being able to be fully present at the church. I mean, I did my very best, but it was like there was this tug of war between the parachurch ministry and the church ministry. It was really, really difficult. And so in 2010, my husband decided that he really he needed to step out. He wasn't in a good place emotionally. He wasn't in a good place spiritually. He was becoming cynical. He was becoming very down. He had had a history of up and down depression all of his life. So I thought that, okay, this is another one of his depressive periods. It's, I agreed that he probably needed a break. So he stepped away from the church ministry, actually launched his own construction business. He was like, you know what? A 2x4 doesn't tell me that I'm wrong. And I am just going to, I'm just going to do something that I love doing, which he'd always kind of done on the side. He had a real knack for that.
Well, so with that, let me go back to that last 5 years, and especially I'm sure in the, even 1 to 2 years before he retired in 2010. What signs, because of what we're gonna be talking about today, what signs were you starting to see? Because I think no matter what we're talking about today, I think, he was experiencing a lot of burnout,
Mm.
Yeah.
and a lot of just tiredness, and probably not a lot of time where there was self-care and
Mm.
family time and, time for him and probably you too, because you're really
Right.
busy, it sounds. So what signs did you start to see happening? And then, if you want to just go ahead once you talk about that, to kind of just see some red flags that were happening, then what happened, and kind of take us into what we're going to be talking about today, once he started his own construction business.
Yeah. Well, I would say that I was starting to see a lot of negativity. Like he would
Mhm.
just be so negative about everything, and just couldn't see the positive side of anything. I also saw his anger really flaring. That
Mm.
was a place he had struggled with his anger earlier in our marriage. Then he had kind of worked through it and he'd gotten to the other side of it, and but I saw it flaring again, but this time it was a little different. It was that I could just tell it wasn't that he was explosive like he had been in the early years. It was that he was silent and simmering,
Mm,
Mm.
and I could feel him pulling away from me, like
mm,
I mean, just pulling. But it wasn't just me. I could feel him pulling away. Period.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because our kids even will say, when they reflect back upon that season of life, they will say, "We knew dad was off. We
mm,
just couldn't figure out what was going on."
Mm.
So you could just feel it, but it was like if I would try to talk about what's going on inside, or it was like I would kind of either get my head bit off, or it would get minimized.
Mm.
mm,
And at that point in time, quite frankly, I'm a different person now than I was then. I was much more avoidant then, and
mhm,
so I would just kind of like just let it roll off of me and go, well, he'll get over it. And so
yeah.
I'd
Mm.
kind of even minimize his struggles at times,
Mm,
not realizing just all of the turmoil that was
Mhm.
going on inside of him and all of the exhaustion and weariness. And I'll tell you the other thing that now that we can look back on, Mark has a shepherd's heart. He is a soft hearted guy, tender, and he is best in a shepherding environment.
Mhm.
yeah.
And so that those first 10 years, he wasn't the number one guy. And it was a perfect fit for him
Mm,
because he didn't have an arrow on his back, and he wasn't in a position that was constantly criticized, which
mhm,
that was really a struggle for him. And when you
Mm.
become the senior pastor and the only pastor, it's like you have that, and
mhm,
he didn't handle that well. Like
mhm,
stuff doesn't roll off of him, it would go straight to his heart. So he
mm,
was really kind of getting beat up because honestly, it wasn't the right fit for his temperament.
Mm.
That kind of responsibility, that kind of criticism was just not the right fit for that. He couldn't see that then. Looking back, we now understand that and we now see that. And even looking back, one of the things we understand is how our messages in childhood play into
Mm.
adulthood so much. And literally, it was just a few years ago that Mark came to me and he said, I had a huge realization. And I said, what? And he said, all of my growing up years, he grew up in a family business. He said, all of my growing up years, the message was, you never want to work for somebody. You always want to be the boss. You
Mm.
never
mm,
want to work for somebody. You always want to be the boss. And he said, I had no idea, but that message was guiding my thoughts. And it's what kept me from being content
Mm.
in that sweet spot
mm,
of where I was those first 10 years.
This first time.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when all of this happened in 2010, started the construction business, and clearly there was not healing that was taking place at this point. It was just going from one thing to another. What happened to y'all's family that kind of radically changed a lot of things for you?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, he really thought once he would step away, I think a lot of times we think, you know what, if we just change jobs, or if we just change where we live, or if we just whatever, the problem is, as Mark now says, he'll say, that was a great idea, except I took me with me.
Mm.
And so he had done a lot of personal healing because Mark was raised in a really unhealthy home environment, a very critical, even verbally and emotionally abusive environment. So he had a lot of junk in the trunk, and he
Yeah.
had worked really hard to try to work through that. But as he often says when we do these interviews together, he often says, I couldn't get free of me.
Mm.
And so, in essence, that continued. Certainly after he left pastoring, he could breathe a little easier. He was enjoying the new challenge of his new construction business and home remodeling. He did view it as ministry. He would go into the homes of elderly people and and help them, and so he viewed it through a ministry mindset.
Yeah.
But he didn't realize how much his identity had been tied to pastoring.
Mm.
He would have said it wasn't. He would have said, it's not at all. My identity is in Christ. But when that role of pastor wasn't there anymore, what it did is it just caused him to begin to spiral even more.
Mm.
And by
Yeah.
2011, I knew he was struggling. I knew he was not in a good place. And I could tell that, this was going to be a spiral that like he'd had before, but man, this one was deeper and darker. But what
Mm.
I didn't understand is he had spiraled so low and he had gotten into such a dark place that when an old high school girlfriend reached out to him on Facebook, he
Mm.
engaged the conversation under the guise of ministry at first. Hey, I know you're a pastor now. I'm going through a divorce. Is there any way that you could help me process this divorce? And he said, sure. And so they started having conversations, and it became an emotional affair. And within a few months, it became a physical affair.
Mm.
And the world
Mm.
just stopped spinning for me at the day that I
Yeah.
discovered that.
Oh my goodness. How long was that time period from when it happened to when you found out? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah. So he started talking with her in June, and I actually discovered in late July. I discovered it on his phone, and the conversations didn't seem to have crossed a strong line, but they were close. And I was like, hey, babe, we always have talked about guardrails, and this seems a little too
Yeah.
friendly, and he was like, you're right. I need to, I'll bring it above board. I'll loop you into the conversations. I was like, okay, I'm great with that. And then he communicated that actually he decided to shut them down, but they didn't shut down. They went underground. And so then it was September when I discovered that it had been there had been physical connection.
Mm. Jill, first of all, I just want to say I'm so sorry that you went through that your family went through that. I can't imagine what that was like going through that.
I would have said we were the least likely. I
Yeah.
really would have.
Yeah.
I just, yeah, I've, I've been through a lot in my life, including breast cancer. And I will say that there is nothing as painful as betrayal and infidelity. It is
Yeah.
very, very painful.
Yeah. Well, we know that you have a thriving ministry together now. and that you speak and you have a podcast and you have this ministry together. So walk us through how did the restoration of your marriage come about? And I think we would all love to know, like, do you still struggle from time to time with trust because of what happened?
Yeah, good question. I will say the answer to your last question, no, I do not struggle with trust. That has been rebuilt.
That's good.
But initially, when I discovered that, we were actually headed, well, I had discovered it one night very late, and we had a counseling appointment the next day.
Mm,
And I decided that I was going to wait until we were at the counselor's office
mm,
to actually communicate what I had
yeah.
discovered. I felt like if I did that before, he probably wouldn't go. And so I did. And I mean, he was in a bad place. He was like, "Yep, I'm having an affair and I am not stopping." And I was
Mm,
like, "Who is this man? Like, this
Wow.
isn't my
yeah.
husband. I don't even know who this man is." So I remember the counselor saying, he actually separated us that day. He met with, and he said, "You know what? I want to talk with you guys individually." So when he sent Mark out into the waiting room, I'm a mess, and I'm like, "What do I do?" And he said, "Well, if he's willing to get help, then I think that he can stay. But if he's unwilling to get help, I think you need to tell him that he needs to leave."
Mm,
So when he talked with Mark, Mark actually said he was willing to get help. I was surprised. So at that point, we didn't have to, initiate a separation. But what happened is he would get help and recommit for a little while. Then he would go back, and he would get help and he would
mm.
go back, and he would get help and he would go back. And that happened literally 7 times
It's
over
like an
the
addict.
9 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really
Mm.
was. And what Mark will describe when he talks about it, what he'll describe is he was very hopeless that anything could change with us, and even that anything could change with him. Like, honestly, our marriage was the scapegoat for his struggle. And it
Mm,
wasn't that there weren't things in our marriage that needed to change. There were. There's no doubt in that. But it was also a scapegoat. And
mm,
so um I I began to realize um that God was calling me to use this season of time to work on myself.
mhm,
And the first day that it happened was like 2 days after I found out about the affair, probably the day after our counseling appointment, and I was begging God. I was home alone. I was flat on my face on my family room floor, just
mm,
crying my eyes out. The carpet was soaked, and I was like, "God, you have to tell me what to do. I don't know what to do. Tell me what to do." And I heard only one thing: "I want you to love him."
mm,
And I was like, I remember almost being angry at that.
mm,
Like, I stood up and kind of looked up at heaven, and I was like, "You have got to be kidding me."
mm.
I don't
Yeah.
know if you've noticed that he's not very lovable right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And God whispered back to my heart, "I don't know if you've noticed that sometimes you aren't either."
Yeah.
I was like, "All right, Lord, you love me when I'm unlovable. I don't know how to do that. I know
Mm,
Yeah.
how to love when it's easy.
yeah.
I know how to love
Mhm.
when somebody's loving you back.
Right.
I don't know how to love when somebody is
Mm,
mistreating you. I don't know how
Mm.
to do that." And so eventually God took me to Romans 12:9-21. And I now call that, in fact, in my Bible, it's written on the side of my Bible, it says unhumanable love. The
mm,
key
Mm.
to unhumanable love, because that's what I started calling that. It was unhumanable because it was beyond my capability as a
mhm.
human,
Right.
but only because of what God could do
Mm.
in me
Yeah.
and through me.
Yeah.
And I didn't do it perfectly. Let me tell you, there were a few nights that I was very human,
Oh,
and
well.
Mm,
I did not love well. on those nights. I remember one particular one when the toilet, at this point we were separated because eventually he left. So he left the following February. And so at this point we were separated, and one of my teenage boys, our kids were 3 were in their 20s and out of the home, 2 teenagers still at home, both boys.
Mm.
And so the boys and I are at home. Mark has moved out, and the toilet overflows on the upper level, comes down into the main level, down into the
Oh
basement.
no.
Yeah, that was a day that that my human side was fully showing, and so I didn't handle that one well. So let's make sure and paint the real picture. But anyway, so in the midst of that, yes, we did separate, and I continued to believe for my marriage. I continued to stand for my marriage, because honestly, I believed that if he would return to his God, he would return to his marriage. And if he would surrender, he would return. I just knew he had this chaos going on inside of him. And honestly, I mean, it was very painful, but I got to a place where I realized that it wasn't about me. That it wasn't that I didn't have things I needed to look at and I needed to change. Absolutely. But there was this chaos going on inside of my husband, and it was about that chaos. It was about the enemy. The enemy was causing confusion and chaos, and Mark was believing lies. And so I had to stand firm, and I had to stand on truth, and I had to stand in prayer, believing for our relationship. And I did, we were at almost a year coming up. It was April, and my counselor, my Christian counselor, started to say, Jill, it's probably time for you to start accepting reality. Like, there may not be a future with Mark. And so he was kind of calling me to, I don't want you to be in denial. It's okay for you to stand for your marriage. I understand that. I'm not gonna fault you for that, but I want you to walk in reality as well. And I appreciated that, but I still didn't feel like God was calling me to do anything other than what he'd given me. And on Easter Sunday of 2012, we had just had a brand new grandbaby up in the Chicago area, which is about 2 hours from our home in central Illinois. I had taken the train up and been there for the birth and helped our daughter for about a week. Mark had stayed at the house with the boys because we were still separated. So he brought the boys up and came up to meet the new little one. And we actually rode back together. We had spent very little time together, but we rode back together just simply out of convenience. We got back super late. And when we got back super late, I said, you still have another 30-minute drive to your house. I'm concerned. It's 2 a.m. You were almost falling asleep driving home. Do you want to just sleep on the couch? And he did. So the next morning, our kids got up, got themselves to church. They're 2 teenage boys. One's on worship team. One is doing sound at church for the Easter services. And so they go ahead and get themselves to church. It's just Mark and I home. I'm getting ready for church. Mark walks in and says, just so you know, I am filing for divorce this week. And that was the first time he had communicated anything with like a deadline on it.
Wow.
My heart dropped. And one of the places God had been working with me is that I had misused my strength and I had misused my voice in our relationship. So if God didn't give me words, I didn't say them. So I just stood there for the longest time because I was like, I don't have any words. And I was praying, Lord, I don't even know how to respond to that. And the only thing that came to my mind, I believe the Holy Spirit gave it to me, was, Mark, when Jesus was facing the cross and he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he didn't want to do what he had to do. But then he surrendered and said, not my will, but yours be done. And Mark stood there for the longest time and he was like, is today Easter? He didn't even know it was Easter.
Wow.
Like, that's how checked out he was. And I said, yeah, it is. And he now says that he heard God's whisper to his heart, Mark, if you'll trust, because at this point he had felt like he'd made a huge mess. The other relationship was having conflict, and the other relationship was having problems. And Mark was actually starting to go, wait a minute, I'm not so sure this is the answer. What is going, wait a minute, there's a common denominator and it's me. So he was starting to do that. I didn't know that. But he was starting to, that was in, but he was also going, I've made a huge mess. I just need to like cut and run. And he heard God whisper to him, if you'll trust me for the mess, I'll take care of the rest. And in that moment, Mark looked at me, he said, I'm going to pray that same prayer. And he did. Wow. He prayed a prayer of surrender right there about 2 minutes after he told me that he was going to file for divorce that week. And when he finished praying, he looked at me and he said, could we go to church? And I was like, sure. I'm thinking, what just happened? I'm not quite sure. And so we did. We went to church, as you can imagine. I mean, he hadn't been in church in over 6 months. And everybody's eyes are as big as baseballs. They've been praying for this.
Wow.
And after church, he said, can I spend the afternoon with you and the boys? And I said, sure. And by that evening, he's like, I can't even remember what I held against you.
Oh my gosh.
Like the surrender was so powerful. Now, at this point, of course, I didn't trust it because we've had this commit, all of that. Right. But I knew something was different. I knew it. And so he broke off the other relationship. We began going back to counseling. I had continued even when he stopped going. He stopped going in the fall, and I had continued, and he went back to counseling. He eventually moved back home about 2 months later because it became very evident he was a new person. Like he really had surrendered. And Mark now says, even when he was pastoring, he was like, I really wasn't fully surrendered. He would argue with God. He would get mad at God. And so, he had accepted Christ at a Billy Graham crusade right before we ever met. So, he's like, I really believe that, I accepted Christ, but I didn't really know what it was like for him to be the 100% leader of my life and my heart. And so he really has become a different man. We now call ourselves Mark and Jill 2.0. And that
I love it.
There's a Mark 2.0 and there's a Jill 2.0, because one of the things I say is that I didn't cause Mark's affair, but I contributed to the dysfunction in our marriage. And I had to begin to look at that. And so I started becoming Jill 2.0 during that dark season. I started to look at myself. As I continued counseling, I began to understand what I was bringing dysfunctionally to the relationship, how I was honestly breaking Mark's trust in some ways. Like he would express frustration and I would minimize it. And I was an avoider, which meant I didn't get very vulnerable in marriage. And so I started making changes, and he was seeing me walk out Romans 12:9-21, that unhumanable love. So he started going, something's different. And at first he thought, she's just manipulating me. But it happened long enough and steady enough that he was like, I think this is for real, which actually gave him hope and helped contribute to the possibility that maybe we could actually be different. Maybe we could heal.
Hey friends, we will get right back to our episode, but we want to take a moment and thank our patrons. You guys keep our podcast going.
If you are not a patron and you would like to consider donating to our podcast ministry, we would be so grateful, and we might even do a happy dance.
When you become a patron,
You get perks like being the first to hear about special info and retreats. You get bonus episodes, monthly devotionals, lock screens, and more.
Plus, we have added a new $1 tier for those who believe in us and what we're doing, just because you love us.
So head on over to our show notes and click on the Patreon link to learn more. Now let's get back to our episode.
Well, as you were talking, and I was listening to the part, especially about trust and how over and over again he's done this, right? And so you're always questioning, is it real this time? Is it real this time? Is it real this time? And then all of a sudden you see this shift, this difference. Is that what contributed to you being able to trust again? Like, what would you say to those who are in this situation and they need to rebuild trust? They want to stay in the marriage. How do they go about doing that? And
Yeah.
even with the slow fades, you talk about that a lot, slow fades. How do we walk away from those, wipe them out, get rid of them so that we're not in the slow fade constantly and going back to where we were? Once again, I think that ties back to trust too.
Correct. So let's talk about trust for a moment. People think that forgiveness and trust are the same thing. They are not. Forgiveness opens the door for trust to be rebuilt.
Yes.
In and of itself, it does not rebuild trust. So my job was to forgive. And quite frankly, his job was to forgive me for the places I broke his trust. I broke his trust with my critical spirit. I broke his trust with me avoiding and not being vulnerable in our relationship. I broke his trust with the way I used my words sometimes to control. And then he obviously broke my trust by being deceptive, by breaking our vows, all of that. So forgiveness opens the door for trust to be rebuilt.
Amen.
That's all it does. Then the process of rebuilding trust begins. And there's only one way to rebuild trust. It's called consistent change behavior over time. That's it. You can't rebuild trust any other way. We like to say that when trust is broke, so when you break trust in a really big way, like infidelity or pornography or deception or, something that is really big, it's like when you have trust in a relationship, it's like a bathtub full of water. And when you do something really big like infidelity or pornography or deception, you pull the plug. The water drains out. So when I forgave him, and by the way, forgiveness is layered. It's not once and done.
Right.
True.
By the time that we were done healing, I'd probably forgiven him 300 to 400 different times for 300 to 400 different parts of the hurt.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think people think it's once and done. And it's like, no. I would drive by a hotel where I knew they met at. And on one day it would bother me, the misuse of money and how he put us in debt. And the next day I would drive by and it would be about the deception. So on one day I'm having to forgive deception. On one day I'm having to forgive the misuse of money,
Wow.
and so forgiveness simply opens up the bathtub so that your spouse can begin to rebuild trust. And so that trust is rebuilt one safe conversation at a time, one non-defensive response at a time, one action of pushing information. Hey, I'm going to be late, but here's where I'm at. And here's a picture of where I'm at. I'm letting you know. My phone is yours. My phone is open to you. Here's all my email passwords. All of those things are what puts a quarter cup, a tablespoon of water back in the bathtub. And that's how trust is rebuilt. And it's rebuilt a quarter cup, a tablespoon at a time. So you can't shortcut it. You can't just say, I'm so sorry, I'll never do it again. And let's just move forward. That's not the way it works.
good.
So that's really important. And if somebody's listening, we have a free rebuilding trust guide. You can get it at rebuildingtrust.us, rebuildingtrust.us. But that's important to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second half of your question, you were asking about the slow fades. So as we were coming out of our mess and we were getting really kind of towards the end of our healing, I remember we were riding home from counseling. And by the way, our counselor was an hour away.
Ooh.
And
Mm.
the counselor was, so we would drive an hour, we would go to counseling for 50 minutes, and then we would drive home for an hour.
Mm.
Healing requires investment,
Mm-hmm.
an investment of
Good.
time, an investment of money.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be willing to do what it takes.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mhm.
so anyway, we were driving back after one of those, and a Casting Crown song came on the radio, and it's a slow
Mm.
fade.
Slow fade. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I remember, there's some of the lyrics are no marriage crumbles in a day. It's a slow
Yeah.
fade.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So I remember saying to Mark, wow, that's pertinent. Could we
Hmm.
name our slow fades? Like, could we identify what they are?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so literally I still had
Mm.
my notebook from counseling. And so I pulled it out and he's driving, and I'm taking notes, and we identify like 7 slow fades.
Mm.
The slow fade of unrealistic expectations,
Mm.
which
Mm.
causes discontentment, which eventually causes disconnection. The slow fade of minimizing, when
Mhm.
somebody makes a bid for connection or somebody communicates hurt and we minimize it.
Yeah.
The slow fade of defensive responses,
Mm.
when somebody talks about their hurt and we defend ourselves instead of tuning into their heart and what's
Yeah.
going on there. The slow fade of avoiding emotion that keeps
Mm.
us at arm's length from each other. And so, honestly, we thought we were doing that for ourselves, only for ourselves. Like, what are we doing? How did we get here? But we started sharing that with friends and family that were in
So
our
good.
healing
Yeah.
Yeah.
community. And
Mm.
they're going, I think that's happening in our relationship.
Mm.
Gosh.
Yeah.
So, eventually, when we started sharing our story more openly about 2015, and then eventually we wrote our No More Perfect Marriages book in 2017, and we included the slow fades in there because it's like this is happening in every marriage. Every marriage is experiencing connection erosion.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
And what if we could help you identify that connection erosion before it's, while your hearts are inches apart instead of miles apart.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and even here's what I want people to know. If your hearts are inches apart, you can heal. If your
Yeah.
hearts are miles apart, you can still heal.
Yeah.
You may need to get
Yeah.
help, but you can heal. And we stop those slow fades by using our God tools.
Yeah.
And so we identified 8 God tools. These are straight out of God's word that we used to become Mark and Jill 2.0. And we realized that as we used those tools like courage, forgiveness, grace,
Mm.
humility, compassion, acceptance,
Yeah.
and as we began to use those, we were becoming different people. Um, Jesus used all of those tools. And so the more we become like him, and then our marriage was healing, we were becoming those 2.0 individuals. And so that's how we stop the slow fades, as we start to use those God tools.
That's
I
good.
love it.
Wow.
Listening to the beginning of your story, I think women out there, especially and men that are listening, like I think that there was a lot of soul care that was not happening, especially in the last 10 years of his ministry. And that's something that I think that a pastor and his wife have to, help themselves, but also I think as a church body and leadership, it has to become so important to take care of those that are shepherding your church,
Yeah.
because they are human and they are literally just like everyone sitting in the
Mhm.
pews. So we definitely just the self care of if you're out there listening, You might not be in this situation that Jill is going through or went through and Mark, but it could be something else. But if healing can come and self-care and taking care of the people that you've put in leadership and to care about their heart more
Yep.
about than how often they're serving and how many hours a day they're working, and if they're in their, office 8 hours a day and then they leave, that we really have to care about the person more than the position. And so I believe that just altogether, just self-care is so important. And I'm not saying that was the end all and it's the church's fault or anything, but just saying that I think that everyone is 1 second away from a sin.
Yeah.
And it really matters,
Well, and
and
what I would even add to that is that we were doing some of the right things on the outside. Like we were
yeah.
taking date nights. We knew each other's love languages and we were speaking them. But we weren't, when you talk about self-care, I 100% agree, but we weren't getting to the root of our struggles.
Right. Yeah.
We were putting a Band-Aid on some things that needed surgery.
Yes.
That's good.
That's right.
And so that's part of the reason now Mark and I do our what we call Marriage 2.0 intensives.
Yeah.
And a Marriage 2.0 intensives is when a couple comes to us and they're struggling, and they come and they spend 3 days with us in our home, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and we work with them to get to the root, to understand the dynamics that are playing out. You don't just have communication issues. You still have messages that are dogging you from childhood. Let's
Yes.
get into those. Let's
Yeah.
get to the heart of this. And I want to say we just had a church that sent one of their staff members and her husband to us for an intensive, and the church paid for it. And I was so proud of that church.
That's
Like
amazing.
that they said, we're going to invest in this couple. They are important to our staff. We know that they are struggling, and we're going to invest. And I wish more churches would value
absolutely.
that kind of
Yes.
help, because that is what begins to make a difference.
Right.
Yeah.
And stop sweeping it under the rug.
Right.
Like don't
Right.
hide it. Like let's care about their hearts more than like
Right.
what it's doing, to the church if people find out these things,
Mhm.
And it doesn't even have to be infidelity. It could be anything, just
Yeah.
turmoil within a relationship. So I love what y'all are doing. We love what you're doing so much. And before we end, because of course we could talk about this all day, but we're definitely going to put all of your resources in the show notes for everyone. And we hope that people will look into those and really pray about how they can use the resources that God has given you, truly. But to walk away and people walking away and hearing all this, I think you really have already given us so many good steps. I really love how much internal, like, Lord, how can I change? Because I think that's a really good point, because I could imagine, and even when Jonathan and I just get in fights, like I'm trying to figure out, like, especially in my 20s, I was like, how can I fix him? Jesus,
Right?
how can we fix this man right here? But really, I love the spirit, and I'm sure there were days where this was harder than others, but what you're able to talk about now is, how can I change? Because I still can't change my husband. I still can't change the sin within his life. And you
Right.
couldn't change Mark's sin. But how can I change my heart toward my husband? And how can I just change my heart to change in general, to grow even in my deepest hurt? And so I think that's just really great advice and testimony, like just your testimony on going through anything in life. We
Right.
cannot change the other person that we're in
Right.
turmoil with. We can only change how we react, how the
Right.
Lord teaches us. And so I really think you've really just given us so much. If you could leave us, with just a question, like not a question, if you could leave us with just sharing with maybe some women or men that are listening to this today, and they're going, this is me. Like I am dealing with this right now, or I am seeing some of those red flags.
Yeah.
What's some last, bit of advice that you could give, or a scripture to get them going in the right direction of healing?
Well, what I would say is get it out of the dark.
Mm.
As long as it is in the dark, the
Mhm.
enemy will work.
Mhm.
And when you begin to bring it into the light, then it starts to break some of that. It doesn't resolve it immediately, but it starts to break some of that. And so whether you're the one struggling or whether your spouse is the one struggling, in fact, one of the things that we love about the ministry that we do now, sometimes it is hard for a pastor or a pastor's wife to get help in their church and in their community. And
Yeah.
we love that we have the ability to understand that world and to understand that life and to be a safe place for them.
Mhm.
And so I would say whether it's us or, there's plenty of other ministries out there, but get the help that you need to walk through what it is that is currently in the dark. Because that's going to begin the process of healing in your own heart and your own life. And it is going to break so much of the hold of the lies that the enemy keeps us held back with shame, which is part of what keeps us from bringing things to the light.
Yeah.
Love that so much. This has been amazing. You have given such great advice. Even for me, I'm taking notes going, oh, we probably struggle with one of those slow fades or two. So just practically being able to go back and start doing some things on my end to better my own marriage. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I know that other people listening are going to appreciate this so much. And I love how you said, bring it to the light. We always say that.
Yes.
And it needs to happen. We got to start confessing things and walking in the light so that we're not doing the slow fades and keeping them hidden.
Right.
Yeah.
And then one after the other, after the other, after the other. So love this so much. But before we go, we have 3 final questions for you that we ask all of our guests when
Get
they are
ready.
on our podcast. And just think rapid fire could be the first thing that pops in your head. You don't have to overthink these. Okay. Are you ready?
Got it. Yep.
Okay. First question. If you could go back and give your pastor's wife, ministry leader self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Stop comparing.
Mm-hmm.
Just love yourself as you are. Embrace who God made you to be and stop wanting to be like other people.
That's good, girl. Okay,
That's right.
number 2. What do you do for fun? I want to hear what you do for fun on your own and what you and Mark do for fun just to kind of get away, put the ministry down for a second and just have fun and, get our mind off of all the things.
So for me, I have the hobby of flower gardening. And so I have a huge flower garden of I just love planting flowers in the spring and having them all summer. So I have a huge amount of zinnias and cosmos. And so I love to have that in my house. And then I also love to bless other people with it. And then what Mark and I do together, we really enjoy hiking. We enjoy walking in beautiful places, exploring beautiful places. So, we'll go out to a local parklands and walk some trails. If we can get to Colorado, we love to hike in beautiful places like that. But we love to hike together.
Sounds amazing. Love it. Okay. Do you want to come to my house and plant some flowers?
I was literally thinking that.
I'm like, I can do the house plant thing. I can keep those alive, but you put something outside. I can't control the environment out there. It's not a good situation.
Also, I don't want to be digging out there. I have no desire.
No, I'm good. Okay. Are you ready for your last and final question, Jill?
Sure.
All right. If you could go tell the congregation one thing without reservation and have them really listen and respond, what would you say?
Stop judging.
Amen.
Just stop it.
Right.
Just stop it.
Praise him.
For sure.
I mean, seriously, it's like, stop judging each other, what people are wearing, what the music is, what the pastor says. what other people's kids are doing. Let's be grace filled, and let's love a lot better than what we currently are.
Love it. So good. Well, thank you, Jill, for all of these words of wisdom. We can't wait for our friends to listen to this. Hi, friends. Hi,
friends.
We know you're there listening.
It's going to be a good one.
We love you. We appreciate you. We're so glad you're here. And until next time,
Talk to you later.
bye.
Okay, friends, if you have enjoyed this episode as much as we have, please help us spread the word on Facebook and Instagram.
If you didn't know yet, Instagram is where all the fun is at. From dance reels on Wednesdays to spiritual encouragement and laugh out loud posts in between, there is something for everyone.
And last but certainly not least, if you could take a moment right now to stop what you're doing and give us a rating and review, even subscribe to our podcast, this seriously helps other people find us who wouldn't be able to otherwise. Thank you so much for your love and support. We hope you'll tune in next week.